and Prognoses of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. This event is organized by the Foundation for the National Interest and Facts Asia in cooperation with the Ateneo School of Government's Policy Center, Miriam College, the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies, the UP Department of Political Science, and the UP Institute of International Legal Studies. My name is Charmaine Willoughby, and I'll be your moderator today. The Strategic Situationer series, of which today's topic is a part, provides a wider discourse platform for strategic and security issues. Here, we explore the Philippines' national security posture from a variety of perspectives involving a wide range of stakeholders, including members of the academe, government, and non-government organizations. Today, we have a stellar lineup of experts who can shed light on the causes and prognosis of the conflict, as well as identify the economic and geopolitical impact of the crisis for Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific. But before we listen to their remarks, may I please remind everyone of the house rules that are in your screen right now. Okay. So we'll begin today's discussion with Dr. Malcolm Davis, a senior analyst in defense strategy and capability with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He's also an honorary assistant professor with the Faculty of Society and Design at Bond University, where he was a postdoctoral research fellow in China-Western relations from 2012 to 2016. He has worked with the Department of Defense, both in Navy headquarters in the Strategy and Force Structure area, and with Strategic Policy Division from 2007 to 2012. He holds a PhD in Strategic Studies from the University of Hull, as well as 2 master's degrees in Strategic Studies, including from the Australian National University's Strategic and Defense Studies Centre. His main research focus is on defense strategy and capability development, military technology, and the future of warfare. Dr. Davis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charmaine, and it's a pleasure to be here for speaking about what I think is the most serious international security crisis that we have had, certainly since the end of the Cold War in 1991. And I would argue potentially since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. What we are seeing in Europe now is a large-scale major power war, which we assumed quite wrongly, I think, would never happen again in Europe. We had become accustomed and comfortable with the thought that we would never face such a threat as what we're seeing now again. Well, how wrong we were. So when we think about where this crisis heads and what the implications are for not only European security, but also for the Indo-Pacific region, I think, we are in very much uncharted territory here. Events are moving very rapidly, almost on an hour-by-hour basis. And yet we are trying to draw long-term analysis from a difficult, rapidly changing and confusing situation. So it's certainly not an easy situation to understand. I think that what we're seeing is essentially as follows. Russia has launched a massive war, an invasion of Ukraine. There's no way you can call this a special military operation, okay? So this is an invasion of Ukraine with the objective of dismembering Ukraine as a nation state, of forcibly removing the Ukrainian government from power and putting in place a pro-Russian puppet regime, and secondly, redrawing international boundaries through the use of force. The Russians are waging a brutal war, not just against the Ukrainian defense forces, but against the Ukrainian people. And I think that the way they're carrying out operations in Ukraine at the moment harks back to what they've done in the past in Chechnya, in 1994, in Syria, in Georgia, and I think that it highlights the fact that the Russians approach war very differently to how Western liberals, democracies approach war. Clearly, from the Russian perspective, concepts such as jus in bello, the laws of armed conflict, discrimination, proportionality, necessity, simply do not enter their minds. And I would go further than that. I would argue that what the Russians are doing now in Ukraine, around Mariupol, around Kyiv, around Kharkiv and elsewhere, they are deliberately targeting civilians to cause as much civilian death and misery as possible, because their objective is to try and break the will of the Ukrainian people and break the will of the Zelensky government and force a surrender on their terms. Having said that, the Russian military campaign is not going well for them. I've seen, since the beginning of this war, I've seen a textbook example of how not to use military force by the Russians. Their logistic support, perhaps the most important aspect of any use of force to maintain adequate logistic support, is simply missing in action. So you have fighting forces operating well in advance of their logistics trains, running out of fuel, operating in small numbers, being exposed, being overrun. And the Russians clearly have essentially forgotten all their military training that they would have done in any other war in terms of how you utilize logistics with fighting forces. It's just mind-blowingly dumb, their approach there. The Russians are meant to be fighting in a combined arms operation. Well, it's not there. We're seeing, as I said, small units being operated well in advance of support from artillery and air power. There's no control of the air by the Russians. And even though they have now brought most of their forces that they deployed near Ukraine and in Belarus into action, the absence of logistic support, the spirit and the morale of the Ukrainian defenders against the absence of morale on the part of the Russian defenders means that their offensives have bogged down. Now, it's possible that in the next few days we could see them positioning their forces, consolidating their gains, and potentially being better placed to attack key urban areas such as Kyiv, potentially launching an amphibious invasion against Odessa, seizing Mariupol. But it's quite possible that this will bog down for the Russians and it will develop into a stalemate. So the question in my mind is, what does President Putin do at that point? There's every indication, based on the rhetoric that's coming out of the Russian government, in particular, the press conference given by Foreign Minister Lavrov last night, that the Russians are looking to create a false flag operation involving chemical and biological weapons in Ukraine. So the use of chemical or biological weapons, or potentially a radiological weapon, would be a huge escalation for the Russians. The next step along the chain from use of thermobaric weapons and cluster bombs against cities and urban areas to kill civilians. So how does the West respond to that? There's already substantial pressure on NATO to put in place a no-fly zone. I think we all understand the potential risks of doing that. The fact that in establishing a no-fly zone, we would have to enforce it, and we would know that the Russians would challenge it. So we would have to shoot down Russian aircraft. And that leads to an escalation chain all the way up to a major NATO-Russia war with all the possibilities of rapid escalation to use of nuclear weapons. But we do face a moral dilemma here now. What the Russians are doing is reprehensible and unacceptable under any international framework of law. We are well within our rights to intervene. If they go the next step and they start using weapons of mass destruction, then I think the pressure for NATO intervention would be almost unbearable for any Western leader to resist. And the question we then have to ask ourselves is, is it better to fight Putin now or fight him later? Because let me finish with some thoughts on how this war could end. Without trying to trivialize the ending of this horrendous conflict, I think there's three possible endings: the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good ending is a color revolution in Moscow that removes the regime from power and sees Putin in prison, and a new government in Moscow that seeks to withdraw from Ukraine without conditions, seeks to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and freedom of choice, including to join NATO and the EU, and makes appropriate reconstitution and reparations, and starts to try and rebuild the relationship with the West, because the current regime, we can't deal with them. So that's the good outcome, and that's the one I hope for. The bad outcome is that somehow the Russians managed to inflict such devastating losses on the Ukrainians that the Zelensky government withdraws to Lviv. The Russians control eastern Ukraine, including Kyiv, and the Ukrainians fight on, as understandably they would, in a war of insurgency and resistance from within occupied eastern Ukraine. But the implications of that is that we then face a prolonged period of tension and possible confrontation lasting decades. In effect, it's a new Iron Curtain scenario in Europe, with the potential for a wider war occurring at any other time. So that's the bad outcome. There's no possible status quo ante solution. There's no possible way back for a relationship with the Putin regime if that happens. The ugly outcome is escalation. It's the possibility that Putin might choose to use chemical weapons on a significant scale, or potentially biological weapons, or even escalate to de-escalate with the use of a tactical nuclear weapon to try and force NATO to back down and force Ukraine to back down. And where that goes, I don't know, because I think that NATO could not stand by and do nothing in that scenario. We would have to intervene militarily against Russia. And we all understand the outcomes of that. So that's the ugly scenario, where we potentially end up in a crisis much, much worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there are some implications, of course, for the Indo-Pacific, particularly in terms of how China is watching this crisis, its plans for Taiwan in this decade. And I don't want to take up the other speakers' time, so I'm happy to address those points in the Q&A. But those are the starting points. That's my perception of where the war is going, how it could end up, and the implications of this conflict in Europe. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Dr. Davis, for giving us those three scenarios. Certainly, these are things that we need to think about, hopefully to achieve the better outcomes, and do our very best to avoid the bad and the ugly outcomes. I know there are a couple of questions now in our chat box. Please keep those questions coming, and I'll do my very best to categorize them later during our Q&A. For now, let's move on to our second speaker, Ms. Maya Otarashvili, who's a research fellow and deputy director of the Eurasia program. She's also the deputy director of research at the Foreign Policy Institute. She's co-editor of FPRI's 2017 volume, Does Democracy Matter? The United States and Global Democracy Support. She's a PhD candidate at the War Studies Department at King's College, London, and holds an MA in Globalization, Development, and Transition from the University of Westminster in London, with emphasis on post-authoritarian transitions. Her research interests include geopolitics and security of the Black Sea Caucasus region, Russian foreign policy, and the post-Soviet frozen conflicts of Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Transnistria. Maya, please go ahead.
Good morning to most of the guests here. I think I'm so happy to see such a great turnout. Full disclosure, it's still March 10th where I am. I'm in Philadelphia, in the United States, and I'm grateful to be a part of this conversation. Thank you for inviting me. I thought Dr. Davis's remarks were excellent. They set the stage really well. I'm going to try my best not to repeat any of the points that he made. And also sort of try to respond to some of the things that he mentioned. We are approaching we are actually at a 2-week marker at the moment since the war broke out. I wouldn't say that we did not see this coming. The escalation. So obviously, I thought the background that you guys put together for this was quite excellent and gave a nice overview to our audience members for this event. But so I won't go as far as, discussing the Soviet era and pre-Soviet connections between Ukraine and Russia. And I won't talk that much about the 90s, but, the 2013 Euromaidan was mentioned in the background reading materials. And then you guys also spoke about Russia's annexation of Crimea and the Russian-backed separatist conflicts in Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine that broke out in 2014 and have never been settled, right? So those two territories essentially joined what used to be called the frozen conflicts in the post-Soviet space, but essentially the protracted post-Soviet conflicts, right? But in April of 2021, we began to see Russia's buildup on Ukraine's borders, major military buildup on Ukraine's borders. And again, this was April of 2021, so almost a year ago. Ever since then, we've been noticing that Russia was getting ready to invade. That summer, we were able to de-escalate. And when I say we, I mean sort of the West, right, and Ukraine, because of where I'm sitting at the moment. I think, President Biden was a new president in the United States, and Putin tends to test the grounds to see what a new American president is and is not willing to go for. So this military escalation seems to be one of those situations. So President Biden became involved. There was a summit between Putin and Biden in the summer of 2021, and it seemed like Putin was preparing to de-escalate as a result of it. But come fall of 2021, we began to see again sort of repositioning of Russian military personnel on Russia's borders with Ukraine, and this time also in Belarus, with Belarus's borders with Ukraine. So we've been expecting this war for quite some time, and the Ukraine and the West spent most of December, January, February trying to de-escalate, trying to find a military solution. But I want to draw your attention to November. I'm sorry. Actually, like early August of 2021, when Putin published one of his crazy op-eds where he was talking about the roots of the shared roots of the Russian and Ukrainian people, and how Donetsk and Luhansk were suffering under some kind of a Nazi Western-backed takeover of Ukraine, and how it was Russia's prerogative to defend freedoms of Ukrainian people because the government in Ukraine was a puppet regime of the West, and how the West was using Ukraine as a tool to sort of position its military assets in Ukraine. It was not only was it historically revisionist, this crazy op-ed that he wrote that was many pages long, which by the way, later on became mandatory study material in the Russian army. Not only were the historical facts entirely distorted, Putin seems to think that he's a historian now, But it also shared very disturbing views of Putin. And it was very clear that he's become very emotional about the post-Soviet space, but particularly he remains very emotional about Ukraine. It's some strange crusade that he seems to have, right? So since July, when we read this manifesto, we were ready to see, right? It was a great way for him to justify and prepare for this invasion. This is why I think it's important to look at the discourse, right? Because he uses the strange language that continues that conversation. He says that it's a special operation in Ukraine intended to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Let me remind everyone that the president of Ukraine has a Jewish background, and that many of the civilian casualties and casualties of this humanitarian crisis are actually Jewish people or people of Jewish background, people who have been victims of persecution before as part of the Soviet Union. So these false narratives are a great tool of Russian propaganda that they've used in the post-Soviet space and beyond for many, many years, and that they're very actively using right now, not just abroad, but particularly at home. Because since this war broke out, Putin has taken every measure to close down the information space within Russia, which was previously already highly limited, and really amp up the disinformation efforts, calling this a special military operation and not a war, not an invasion, and using this language about denazification, which could not be farther from the truth. So these are some of the basic facts that I think are really important to keep in mind as we look at this conflict. Now, according to the UNHCR, as of a day or so ago, 2.2 million refugees have already fled Ukraine, essentially into Europe, into the European Union, because the country borders Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland. These are EU member countries, and then Moldova, which is not an EU member country, but one of Europe's smallest and poorest countries, which has, along with its other European neighbors, essentially removed all red tape for migrants, allowing the refugees to come in and offering them a home. We've seen amazing solidarity for Ukraine, but I think, again, because I'm talking to my colleagues in a whole another part of the world, I would be remiss not to mention, right, that Europe has a rather mixed track record when it comes to mitigating humanitarian crises or even accepting refugees, right? It was just a few months ago that we had yet another humanitarian crisis in Europe, at Europe's borders, where refugees were trying to enter the European Union from its borders with Belarus. There were about 2,000 migrants stuck at the border in Belarus at Belarus's President Lukashenko's invitation. And, these countries, particularly Poland, backed by the EU leaders, was, very adamant, saying this is a hybrid warfare tool. Do not come here. We're not able to accept these refugees, and declaring martial law and refusing all refugees. So this is a very stark change from many years of really mixed record for Europe on refugee crises. And I would choose not to call this selective sympathy, rather than maybe this is the humbling experience that might change how the West, and particularly the European nations, see humanitarian crises and their role in these crises, and how they treat refugees going forward. Perhaps this is definitely a wake-up call for many, many people. And I think the world as we know it is going to change very drastically whenever this conflict comes to an end. I'm mindful of my time, so let me just make a few points. Ukraine has 44 million people. So yes, 2.2 million people are displaced at the moment, but if this war continues, and no matter how gracious the West decides to be, right, you cannot really expect 44 million people to die or leave. And the atrocities are mounting. As Dr. Davis explained, as time has gone by, it's been 2 weeks, but, the 48-hour plan failed. It was very clear that Moscow expected that Ukraine would just essentially give up, that Kiev would fall within 48 hours, that the Ukraine military would not be able to fend off the Russian assault. But Russia has lost 10% of its military assets in this war in the 2 weeks, right? Morale is low. We are seeing unexpected levels of incompetence in Russian military in this war so far. But despite the fact that Ukraine seems to be winning, we are actually expecting a major, major escalation here. We're expecting Russia to double down. I think the chemical and biological weapons conversation was just introduced over the past couple of days. And that just tells you how Moscow is willing to go anywhere, whatever it takes, right, to achieve its goals. And I think one of the most recent examples of this is Syria, where indiscriminate bombings of cities, leveling city blocks, not worrying about civilian casualties has been a very common practice. There was this expectation that the Russians wouldn't kill their Slavic brothers, so to speak, in Ukraine, but that's obviously out of the question. Yesterday, I was moderating a discussion about Ukraine as I got the news that, Russia had bombed a children's hospital, injuring 17 people. And as of today, we know that 3 people had died, and one of those was a child. The civilian death toll is mounting. It's unbelievable, and it's very devastating. So the reason why I'm talking about this so much is that the West is stuck in a moment, right, where I don't know how much longer we can stand by and watch this, because at some point, again, what is the red line, right? Is it the use of biological and chemical weapons that will prompt the West to intervene? Or is it going to be, a possible attack on the Chernobyl nuclear reactor that is currently sort of buried in this type of a sarcophagus? But, we have that danger as well. And it seems like I really liked how Dr. Davis said, really what we're facing right now is, does the West go to war with Putin now or a little bit later? And sadly, I genuinely think those are the only 2 options. But I would say that going to war with Putin may not be what everyone expects, right? Like the nuclear option, there are many, many, many things that can happen before the nuclear option. So I think it's really important to be very careful and very strategic when we have these conversations, whether it's about the no-fly zone or the humanitarian corridors, and understand that it's not a matter of, we go from what's happening right now to a nuclear war in a matter of 10 minutes. That's not really how it will go. The West has many tools at its disposal. The Ukrainian army still stands because the West has been arming it and equipping it for so long. And there's still many options for this and many ways that the West can continue to support the Ukrainian army. Without major support, we expect that it will, Kiev would fall in 2 weeks, right? But all evidence shows that the West is not prepared to let Kiev fall. And the Ukrainian people's heroic fight against the invaders has, I think, really inspired many, many people in the West and have made them feel like, okay, it's, Ukraine deserves all the support in the world. So I have quite a few other comments that I wanted to make, but I'm recognizing my time limit. So maybe I'll stop here and either in the Q&A or at some point later on, I can make some of my other points. But I would say the no-fly zone discussion right now is the biggest one. Washington is under a lot of pressure to consider the no-fly zone. establishing a no-fly zone over Ukraine. There was a recent letter sent to the White House by 20-some, military and security experts calling for a limited no-fly zone. Let me just say this. You call it a humanitarian no-fly zone, limited no-fly zone, or a full no-fly zone, it's all the same thing. Unless you know that you will and can enforce a no-fly zone, meaning some form of NATO forces would enforce this, i.e. be willing to shoot down Russian military planes, there can be no fly zone on a limited or a larger scale. So this is a very, very serious conversation. Putin has said that he would consider an establishment, the West's initiative to establish a no-fly zone, a way for the West to become directly involved in the war. He hopes that this conflict is seen at least as a proxy war between Russia and NATO. I will tell you that it is not at the moment, and that NATO leaders are doing everything they can to make sure that this does not become a conflict between Russia and the West, Russia and NATO. But I just don't know how much longer those conditions can be sustained, because it seems to me like, if this war continues, there's significant chance of the West becoming involved. One caveat here is, and again, Dr. Davis mentioned this, is some type of a regime change within Russia, which seems unlikely in the short term. What does seem likely in the short term, short to midterm, right, within a couple of months, if this war drags on, is that Russia will not actually be able to sustain the conflict because of the severe, debilitating economic sanctions. That it will not be able to continue fueling its military operation in Ukraine, and that it will start to implode. The regime will start to implode from within. But again, that's most likely to happen very, very slowly and gradually over time. So I think, Russia is on the losing side of this in any scenario whatsoever. I think, even if it is to divide Ukraine and, establish a new Iron Curtain, the Ukrainians are not going to let Moscow get away with this. And I think Russia is going to see a major resistance that is not going to die down anytime soon. And we've seen that the protracted conflict in the region for Russia has been a money loser and has been a major factor sort of in draining Russia and isolating Russia. So could Russia is going to become a version of Iran within a few months, right? So could Iran fuel a major kinetic war in another country for multiple months? Absolutely not. So I don't think Russia is actually capable to keep this up for very long. So I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions and engage with the other speakers. I'm so sorry I went a little bit over time.
That's totally okay. But thank you so much, Maya, especially for flagging the pervasiveness of false narratives. Our hope really is that webinars like this can help clear those types of discourses. Now, our last speaker before we go to our open forum is Mr. Shinkichi Fujimori, a researcher in the Slavic Research Center at Hokkaido University. He co-authored and contributed books on Ukraine and Ukrainian-Russian relations with the European Union. He earned his degree from the Graduate School of Political Science at Keio University, and his research interests include comparative politics, energy issues with the former Soviet Union, and Ukraine-Russian relations. Shinkichi, you have the virtual floor.
Hi, just a moment. I'd like to use my PowerPoint. Just a moment. Sorry. Just a moment. Yes, sorry. Do you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much. My name is Shinkichi Fujimori, and it is my honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Yes. Today I'd like to show a very simple picture about the causes, because every country has many wide range of options, and it is true that Russian Federation had a wide range option toward Ukraine. And especially 1990s, Russia has very many options, such as economic statecraft, natural gas or tariff policy, and also Russian language media. I mean, Kremlin-backed media is very powerful too toward Ukrainian, and also mobilize Ukrainian voters for bribe. Bribe is very effective. I must say that every Ukrainian presidents are bribed by Russian Federation. But this is not case in after 2014. I mean, after invading Crimea and intervene to Donbass, and now we saw that so-called coercive diplomacy, threat to use force, and which we can see in Minsk agreement. But suddenly, Russian Federation dropped this option and now started to invade, so use the forces, military aggression. So today I'd like to touch upon the neutrality, because neutrality is initial demand of Putin, and Dr. Davis clearly described that the demands are drastically inflated, but the initial demand neutrality. And if you see the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russian Federation, they published so-called treaty between the US and Russian Federation of security guarantees. And it is clear that their demand is neutrality of Ukrainian or non-NATO accession. And it is true that this has very long history, and Russian Federation consistently insists Ukrainian neutrality. And after the collapse of Soviet Union, we see there were three neutral states: Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. And Belarus was just dropped. Belarus just dropped its neutrality 2 weeks ago, but Moldova still keeps a neutral status. And the Ukrainian is with my main task. So the neutrality started in 1990 in Ukraine. That was Soviet era, and it said the Ukrainian SSR proclaims its intention to become a permanently neutral state, blah, blah, blah. And this is just a parliamentary resolution. So if you take majority of seats, then you can override this neutrality. So very weak, but this is a start point of Ukrainian neutrality. And then again, I'd like to stress the importance of neutrality because Minsk Protocol, which was signed in 2015 February, just after Ukrainian armies were crushed in Debaltseve. And you can see Charter 11 that Ukraine carrying out constitutional reform and gave special status to Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. That means federalization of Ukraine and veto and the People's Republic have veto over NATO accession. So this is the Putin's initial tactics to prevent Ukrainian accession to NATO. But as you know, Putin suddenly abandoned this idea and started invasion. So a neutrality. Now Russia is using military forces, but in 1990s, they managed very well, I mean, buying neutrality. For example, offset gas debts or discount gas price, because the Gazprom is owned by Russian Federation and very tight, very connected very well with Kremlin. And if you see the partition treaty on Black Sea Fleet, which was signed in 1997, and this is a lease agreement, 20 years lease agreement of Sevastopol naval bases. So Russia buy Ukrainian neutrality because if you use if Russian naval forces situated in Ukrainian territory legally, then NATO cannot move to Ukrainian territory. And also, if you see the Russian-Ukrainian Friendship Treaty, which was signed at the same moment, Article 6 clearly describes the Ukrainians' neutrality status. Again, also this was, we can see even after 21st century, Ukrainian turns to NATO membership soon after 9/11, which, if you remember, that this is a honeymoon between Russian and NATO area. So Ukrainian government used this moment and they said we can join NATO in near future. But again, Russia tried to override this NATO membership policy, and 2010 April, again, Russia buying Ukrainian neutrality. Again, discount gas price, and they continued to reach agreement on Sevastopol naval bases 25 years plus. That means by 2042, Ukrainian cannot join NATO. And also, Ukrainian parliament passed the so-called law on principle of domestic and foreign policy, and in which Ukrainian clearly mentioned that Ukrainian is a non-participant from military political alliance. That means neutrality. But everything is changed after Maidan Revolution. And before Maidan Revolution, Russia again used state economic leverage. For example, trade war, Russian Federation said that if you want to go to EU, then the tariff will rise. Free trade agreement is no longer exist. And again, discount gas prices by 40%. This is crazy, but Russia think this is worth to do that. And buying Ukrainian government bond, and also agree to direct invest to Ukrainian territory. So the Yanukovych, the then president, cancels the sign, and we remember that what happened after this event, annexation of Crimea and intervention to Donbass. So everything is drastically changing, and this will limit Russia's wide range of options. For example, natural gas. Natural gas worked very well in 90s, but then it never happened because Lithuania is no longer importer of Russian gas. If you see 2050, Ukraine stopped importing Russian gas and turned to EU market. So natural gas is no longer a tool for Kremlin. And also tariff policy is also no longer a tool for Russian Federation. 2014, the sanction, Ukrainian government introduced sanction to Russian Federation. So Russian Federation also introduced sanction. So the share of Russian market is drastically dropping, and the last year only 5%. So tariff policy is no longer a tool for Russian Federation. And I'm speaking too much, so I'd like to simplify. Mobilize voters. The Kremlin-backed politicians such as Yanukovych or Medvedchuk, whoever, supported by Donbass and Crimea. So their main resources for voting is these two regions. But what Putin did is choking pro-Kremlin politicians. First, annexation Sevastopol, annexation Crimea. So the pro-Kremlin voters are disappearing from Ukraine. And then Donbass. This is Yanukovych's hometown. But again, intervene. So some part of Donbass voters also disappeared. So that means it is impossible to win by election. So I sum up my presentation. Used to have a lot of options for Kremlin toward Ukrainian policy, but after Maidan Revolution, the options are limited thanks to Putin's policy. And then what remains for Kremlin is using military forces or threat to use military forces. And I'm not sure that why Putin didn't pursue to threat to use military, and we saw he is using direct military aggression, but I still believe that Minsk agreement should be give some advantage for Putin, but I couldn't understand why he dropped to do that. That is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fujimori. And now we are moving towards our Q&A. What a lively chat box we have. And I see a variety of threads in these questions and comments that have cropped up. Now, let me try to categorize these questions and ask our speakers and our panelists to address them. The first bulk of questions that I have is in regard to the implications of the crisis for the Philippines and for ASEAN. Maya spoke about false narratives and discourses. So I was wondering if any of you or all of you can comment on, well, the Philippines initially released a statement saying that it was going to be neutral in this crisis, but then it changed its statement to a condemnation of Russia's actions. What do you think are some of the implications in the rhetoric, in the narrative, and the discourses if we had stayed on this neutral course? And what would that mean for, the overarching story or narrative that we have about the crisis? So Maya, perhaps we can start with your thoughts on this.
Sure, thank you so much. That's a great question. I think so. There's two kinds of neutrality that have come up so far today, and one is the kind of neutrality that Dr. Fujimori was talking about. I think we have to understand that when it comes to Russia and when it comes to the post-Soviet space, when you are a post-Soviet state, declaring neutrality does not win you anything. It is implied that you are a Moscow-friendly state in that case, if you declare neutrality, and it implies that you're not going to seek a Western integration path, and that you're not going to, sort of challenge the Russian hegemony in your country. So it's not really perceived in its purest form as military neutrality, right? Moldova is a very good example of this. Moldova remains neutral technically, right? But what has that gained Moldova, right? When still to date, for over 30 years now, Russia has occupied Moldova's Transnistria region, fuels conflict there, and is making sure that, Transnistria never becomes part of Moldova proper. So again, neutrality is not really something that is going to win you much, especially when Putin can interpret any of the treaties, any of the agreements, any of the formal conditions on the table. He can decide that he's interpreting it in a different way. And I think, NATO enlargement is a very good example of this, right? Because Russia keeps claiming that NATO promised that it would not expand. There was never such a promise made, and NATO's expansion is between NATO and the potential member countries. It is for Ukraine to decide whether it's going to join NATO or not. It's not for anyone else, right? It's a security organization that aims to, sort of strengthen defenses, not to attack anybody. So that's a whole separate conversation. So in this case, for Philippines, declaring neutrality, I think, that may have been a clever policy initially. This is a different kind of neutrality, meaning we're not going to back one warring party or the other. But as the time goes by, it's becoming very clear that if you stand by and do nothing, or God forbid, if you support Putin, pragmatically speaking, right, you're betting on a losing horse. Putin is becoming increasingly isolated. Do you want to be doing business with a country that has had its market shut down, right? Its markets have been shut down for over a week. So it is the situation, especially with the civilian, the humanitarian crisis. It's becoming one of those situations that, you're either with us or against us, right? From Ukraine's perspective. So I think it is clever, again, not just for sort of these altruistic humanitarian reasons, but just for like practical business reasons too. It is clever to distance yourself from Russia and to, again, not bet on the losing horse. There is no way out of this for Russia that is going to lead to a prosperous Russia and a prosperous Putin regime. That's completely out of the question at this point. Under the sanctions, the Russian economy is completely being choked out. So even if Kiev falls, even if there's some military gains that Russia accomplishes over the next few weeks, in the long run, in the big picture, this is a country that it's on its way down. This is a regime that's crumbling, and it makes no sense to back it or in any way try to stand with Russia. Everyone is jumping ship. So I think it is smart on many levels for the Philippines to sort of distance itself from Russia. And I would say the same for China. And we are starting to see signs of that as well. So I'll stop here. Maybe the other speakers have comments. Maybe that, they have more familiarity with politics and foreign policy of Philippines.
Thanks so much for clearing that up. Maya, Dr. Davis, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, look, I think Maya made some really good points. I don't see that you gain anything through neutrality. Just take a look at what India is going through at the moment in terms of its unwillingness to condemn the Russian actions. And, there has been, rumblings amongst some Southeast Asian states, whether they should remain neutral. And I think that's the basis of this question. But you don't gain anything because this is not a conflict where there's some sort of ethical, moral gray zone as to who's in the right and who's in the wrong. This is a black and white conflict where the Russians have been the aggressors from the outset and the Ukrainians are defending their right to exist. And if you can't condemn the Russian government, the Putin regime, for what it's doing in Ukraine, particularly in terms of brutally killing Ukrainian citizens deliberately, then really I think the government's moral and ethical base is all wrong. And you then have to start questioning, what are your values as a nation state? So I do think that it's important for the international community as much as possible to be unified in condemnation of Russia and to support Western sanctions as much as possible. Of course, you're going to get holdouts like China and North Korea. But for democracies, and I would say the Philippines is democracy, it's vital to stand firm for the values and the beliefs and the morals and the ethics that we supposedly all believe in, and that the Putin regime is violating on an hour-by-hour basis. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much for that, Dr. Davis. If I could stay with you for a follow-up question, still in regard to the implications of this crisis for the Philippines, for Southeast Asia or the Indo-Pacific, you spoke about the three scenarios: the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, I'd like to hear your thoughts about the kind of international intervention, if we can even call it that, the kind of, what kind of international intervention would be required in order to avoid the bad and the ugly scenarios that you mentioned? To what extent should negotiations go? What is the depth, the level of sanctions that must be imposed now or afterwards? What are your thoughts on this, sir?
Well, look, I think negotiating with the Putin regime is off the table because very clearly they are not interested in some sort of negotiated outcome. That was very clear in the lead up to the conflict, where we constantly bent over backwards to try and provide them with diplomatic off-ramps and a reasonable solution to the crisis, and they threw it back in our faces, every single one. And now that they've begun this brutal war, we can't sit down and negotiate with them as they're massacring civilians. So when we talk about intervention, we're doing it already in the form of economic sanctions. They need to be swiftly ramped up in terms of the intensity and the scope to create as much economic pain for the Putin regime and the oligarchs around him as possible. So we can apply pressure directly onto the government of Vladimir Putin, but I think the oligarchs around him, the Siloviki that keep Putin in power, are the areas where we need to apply the greatest focus of economic pain and pressure. At the same time, I think diplomatically, Medvedev, for example, said the other day, well, we need to cut ourselves off from the international community. Well, fine. Let's see how they find that in reality when we do isolate Russia in every sense for the indefinite future, when they have no access to international fora. Now, there's a challenge there in the sense that the UN Security Council, Russia is as a permanent member. There's no easy way to, firstly, force Russia to give up its presidency of the Security Council, and secondly, to remove it as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, because Russia can veto it. So there's a flaw there in the UN Security Council, that in the UN system, that I think really needs to be addressed. How can you possibly have a permanent member of the UN that is violating every single aspect of the UN Charter on an hour-by-hour basis, there has to be a way to remove that member from the UN. But that's another issue. In terms of the military aspect of intervention, this is where it gets really dicey, because every single path we go down in terms of military intervention, starting with a no-fly zone, going all the way to direct military intervention, boots on the ground, leads to escalation and a probable NATO-Russia war that potentially could see use of nuclear weapons. I think Maya's point that there are levels between that initial intervention and global thermonuclear war is worth exploring. How is there a possibility of somehow keeping a NATO-Russia war below the nuclear threshold? That's something that if we did militarily intervene, we would need to look at. But I'm not confident there is, but it's certainly something that we would need to address. Because the Russians, after all, know that even as they're making nuclear threats and rattling nuclear sabers, we have nuclear weapons too. And we can retaliate if they use nuclear weapons against us. So they have as much to lose as we do at that level of conflict. But there's no easy answer here. I think that's the key point I want to make. There's no quick fix. There's no easy way out of this crisis. And we just have to find our path through the fog of war and the smoke and the haze to try and find a solution. But frankly, I'm not confident that we could avoid either the bad or the ugly outcomes.
Thanks for that. Now, for the next question, this has to do with the causes of the conflict. So we'll have to go back in history, and perhaps Mr. Fujimori can help us untangle these threads. Does the Russian invasion, the current Russian invasion, does it have a religious angle or an ideological basis? Any thoughts on this? Any light that you can shed on this, sir?
Yes. Dr. Otarashvili already told that the Putin's article in July and sorry, could you repeat your question?
If there is a religious or ideological angle to the causes of the conflict.
No, because well, first I believe that Putin said that Ukrainian and Russian is один народ. That means so I believe that this his way of thinking didn't read military aggression, but what we saw now is military aggression and killing ordinary Ukrainian people. So many people said that the Putin's way of thinking with Ukrainian aggression, but this is just the excuse, and Putin said we will liberate the ordinary Ukrainian people from neo-Nazi regime, but we see the opposite phenomenon. So right now, I think this is just the excuse, and there is no reason there is no any ideological basis between current aggression and Putin's way of thinking. Yes, that's all.
Thanks for your insight, sir. Maya, anything to add to this on the causes of the conflict?
Yeah, I completely agree with Dr. Fujimori. I mentioned that sort of the manifesto letter, historical revisionist madness that Putin has been spinning for quite some time now, not just since July, but in July, he put it in writing that he could introduce in the curriculum for the Russian armed forces. Look, there is no religious anything to this. Russia is bombing churches in Ukraine left and right now, right? So this idea that Moscow or Putin has been cynically spinning with, within the post-Soviet space, with these countries, right? There has been like this religious diplomacy over the past few years where Russia actually tries to somehow gain control over these post-Soviet Christian countries by penetrating their Orthodox, churches. It's all cynicism. Putin is a former KGB spy. His inner circle, most adults in Russia, they're all atheists. Anyone who grew up in the Soviet era, right? They were forced to become atheists. They grew up in an era of atheism. Putin believes in just one God, and that God is his own power and wealth, and also, his responsibility to answer to his inner circle, the Russian elites that demand Russia's greatness on the global scale. I think this is why it's less about ideology and religion right now, to be honest with you. And a lot of what I'm hearing my colleagues talk about and what I'm noticing is the more that this man makes his speeches and the more he shares his thoughts, the more deranged he sounds. I used to talk to my colleagues for many years and they would be like, Putin is a former KGB spy. He's a shrewd, calculating, pragmatic leader. Even those people over the past few months have been saying how they genuinely question Putin's mental stability, whether or not he's thinking clearly. We know he's not online. We know his inner circle is the people he interacts with every day are a bunch of yes men. We know the information he receives is highly filtered. We know how isolated he is. Despite all of this, the information he does receive about the outside world very clearly angers him right now, and he's angry at the world's response to what he's doing in Ukraine. So this war, to me, is a combination of, the leader who's deranged and has severe delusions, and of course, a lot of ego, a lot of sort of this grandiose delusional thinking about somehow leaving a mark on the Russian history and bringing back the country's greatness that it had during its imperial past. All of it is futile. All of it is incredibly out of touch with today's reality. Unfortunately, the death toll, I've read, people saying the sanctions on Russia are causing so much hurt and so much pain on the rest of the world, and there are ripple effects here. You have to remember, this is not about the people who are putting the sanctions on Russia. You have only one person and one regime to blame, and that is Putin's regime. And the rest of these countries, whether that's Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, seeking a NATO membership has been the only way that they seek a safe haven away from constant Russian assaults on their independence and their desire to pursue a developed sort of democratic way of life. Sorry, I am very worked up about all of this because obviously it is unbelievable to see this kind of a large scale assault, Kiev being bombed for 2 weeks now, and all major Ukrainian cities being bombed. Thousands of civilians dead, and again 2.2 million people so far have been displaced. So this is a major crisis that I would encourage. I'm glad we have such a great turnout today, and I would encourage all of you to keep an eye on this because this will shape the future of the world as we know it.
Thanks so much, Maya. Now, my next question is, I'm going back to Dr. Davis for this. And there have been a couple of questions about how this implicates or how this plays out in China. As of now, Beijing still refuses to condemn the Russian invasion and continues to provide Moscow with economic corridors to cushion the sanctions imposed by the West. How do you think this decision by Beijing affects its economic relationship with the West?
Look, it's a good question, but it was even clear before the Russian invasion, that Moscow and Beijing were drawing closer together. That statement that was released from Beijing just prior to the Winter Olympics, I think, said everything. What you are having is China and Russia drawing closer together, not necessarily as an axis or an alliance, but some sort of partnership whereby they are coordinating their actions and responses to developments in Western liberal democracies. Their long-term objective is ultimately to challenge the democratic-led rules-based international order and revise it with an order led from Beijing, with Russia as the junior partner, in effect. And I think that what we need to be concerned about is what China essentially observes from, firstly, Russia's actions in Ukraine in terms of how they've used military force or the threat of military force to achieve their objectives. And by that, I'm specifically referring to the rattling of nuclear sabers versus the Western response to those actions. And I think there's two lessons to draw here. Firstly, China has always promoted its no first use nuclear doctrine, which said it would not be the first to use nuclear weapons. And now you've got Putin basically making fairly implicit nuclear threats to the West, raising the alert level of nuclear forces, carrying out really provocative nuclear exercises. This is rattling nuclear sabers. And that process, I think, has really constrained the ability of the West to respond more forcefully. So I think in the context of future crises, perhaps over Taiwan, what you could see is Beijing thinking, well, actually, rather than maintaining this no first use posture, let's actually have some sort of ambiguity there. And let's think about how we would use nuclear threats in the lead up to a Taiwan crisis to constrain the ability of the US and its allies to intervene in support of Taiwan. And so that's the first point. The second point is the Western response to Russia's actions, I think, has probably caught China by surprise, because you have had a much stronger, much broader coalition of Western states with greater resolve to respond at least at a political and economic level and diplomatically level, much more decisively than probably what Beijing anticipated. So they would read into that if China, or when China does move to invade and annex Taiwan, probably sometime in this decade, to fully expect a strong diplomatic and economic response from the West. But the one issue here is that China is not Russia in terms of its relationship with the West. There is a much more integrated posture between China and the West in terms of global supply chains, globalization in general. And so that would actually constrain Western ability to respond more decisively. So I think that there's lessons to be learned on both sides there in terms of how China's looking at Ukraine and thinking, well, what is the so what here for our plans for Taiwan? I don't think necessarily that Russia's experience in Ukraine is going to lead to Beijing to think, well, we're not going to invade Taiwan, it's too risky. I think actually it could encourage China to change its plans, maybe change its approach somewhat, but I fear that attack will still happen at some point in this decade.
Thanks so much. Now let me move the conversation to the topic of sanctions and the sustainability and the effectivity of sanctions. We all know that sanctions do not really work in the long term. If anything, they only hurt ordinary citizens and people. So in that sense, what do you think are some of the other options or alternatives that the rest of the world has in terms of inflicting some damage, but not so much as on the ordinary citizens? Is there anything that we can still do? And perhaps for this round, maybe I can start with Mr. Fujimori.
So you mean ordinary people, you mean Russian citizens or
Right.
citizens all over Russian citizens.
Yes.
Yes. Many people say that Russian people are very strong. I mean, they suffered this kind of drastically dropped exchange rate and also the drop of GDP, especially in 1990s, 90s and 1998, and also the Lehman shock. So I think people could well hold this situation, and so the sanction. I think sanction did effect on the people's ordinary work, but I didn't read any revolution or such kind of many to overthrow the Putin regime or such like. And the sanction must be connected. So the sanction next step will be the import of Russian natural gas and also crude oil and oil production. But this is very difficult for certain European EU countries such as Slovakia or Hungary or Czech, because their import resources are limited to Russian Federation. So this is very difficult to move more strict embargo to Russian Federation. And so I don't believe that sanction will affect any revolutionary or any anti-Putin movement in Russian Federation.
Thank you, sir. Now, Maya, any thoughts on sanctions and perhaps alternatives or options?
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Fujimori. This is going to be, sanctions don't have the immediate results that we hope that they will have. And of course, they cause a lot of pain on, regular Russian citizens. But I agree, they're known to be very strong people. They've overcome much worse than this. However, we have rarely seen sanctions like the sanctions currently, right? Again, I just keep thinking about Iran, the way it's isolated, the way it is left behind in the globalization and development processes. That's where now Russia is headed. Let's remember, yes, Russia has been under sanctions since it invaded Crimea, right? So that is 8 years of being under sanctions, but nothing like what we have now. And these kinds of severe sanctions are very rarely used, right? Turning off, sanctioning the Russian central bank, turning off, removing them from the SWIFT system. I think partly why so many of the sanctions target individuals, oligarchs, their wealth, Putin himself, his wealth, Lavrov, is really with that in mind. Can we do the kind of damage on the regime that does not, that overwhelmingly affects the regime and the elites and not the people as much? Unfortunately, that's not really possible, right? Because the regular people are indeed suffering from the severe economic isolation of Russia. And I think cutting off the U.S., the U.S. cutting off Russian energy imports is a major change. But again, as Mr. Fujimori said, Europe is not really able to cut off Russian energy supplies at the moment. So this has definitely sparked conversations about Europe's very serious need to diversify its energy supplies away from Russia. So these sanctions are severe, unfortunate. There is going to be a lot of civilian suffering within Russia, and again, the ripple effects coming out of it. But let's not forget the civilian suffering and the human suffering that Putin is currently inflicting on Ukraine and its neighboring countries. Again, the ripple effects of the bombing, the bombing hospitals and civilians, right? There needs to be a response. And in a way, you could imagine that economic sanctions are not really, sort of an equal measure response to murdering children and women and hospitalized people. So this is a dark time. Unfortunately, there is no great answer to this question. Individual targeted sanctions, I think, are one of the best ways trying to avoid the impact on sort of regular Russians, but not enough.
Great. Thanks for that. Dr. Davis, still on sanctions.
Sorry, what was the question?
Since sanctions don't seem to work in the long run, are there any other options that we can explore?
Look, I think you're quite right. Sanctions are not having the desired effect, which is to change Putin's decision calculus to get him to realize actually we need to withdraw and we need to have a peace settlement. They're not working. Now we can increase those sanctions so we can somehow convince the Europeans not to buy Russian oil and natural gas. We can tighten sanctions on the Siloviki and the oligarchs to try and put pressure that way. But I have to say, in terms of the arrows in the quiver, they're getting pretty low in terms of sanctions. So I'm not sure that there's much left there to work with. We can continue to try and isolate Russia diplomatically so long as the Putin regime is in power. But there's no guarantee that we could remove the Putin regime from power. There is, as I said, to go back to a point I made much earlier, even if somehow the war in Ukraine reaches a finality whereby Russia controls the eastern half of the country, including Kyiv, and basically incorporates that into Russia, you're going to have a prolonged period of tension in Europe where the worry is that having successfully done that invasion of Ukraine and weathered the storm of diplomatic and economic sanctions, Putin might be then tempted to say, all right, well, maybe I can try Moldova, or I can try the Baltic states. And the Baltic states are obviously NATO, but if he's going to use nuclear threats to try and constrain NATO's response, he might be tempted to try it again. And it goes to Maya's point about his state of mind. We're not necessarily dealing with a rational actor here. So I think we are dealing with someone whose territorial ambitions don't necessarily stop at the borders of Ukraine. So I'm not sure that there is an easy fix or a quick solution to this that somehow brings about the status quo ante. I don't see that happening. I think we've passed that and we're into a new period in European security whereby we are facing a prolonged threat of major power war between NATO and Russia, whether it's centered on Ukraine or whether it's centered on the Baltic states or something else. And that has obviously ramifications in terms of the Indo-Pacific and China as well.
Thank you. Now for my last round of questions, a final word from each of our speakers in regard to what particular lesson do you think the Philippines particularly can learn from the Ukraine-Russia crisis? Some of one or two takeaway lessons for the Philippines. May I start with Mr. Fujimori again?
Yes. I'm not a specialist on Asian region, but my main, is military is not the only one tool for some countries. So bribe or economic pressure or any other kind of tool must be understanding and has to care about it. And of course, many people believe that China's direct military invasion to Taiwan, but what we see now is the China is bribing some one political party, I mean, Kuomintang. So we must care about the other options, I mean, economic and also some the cultural or some people, the people's ties between the countries and the Philippine politicians. That's all.
Thank you, sir. Maya, some lessons for the Philippines?
Sure. Thank you so much. I think, we are still in such shock and trying to figure out what the lessons are, period, right? So it's hard to talk about that at the moment, but I guess I would just say one thing, not just for the Philippines, but for everybody, right, is that, look, once the military escalation takes place, the off-ramps are so few, right? So it's worth investing in peace. It's worth investing in diplomacy. It's worth investing in sort of conflict resolution and de-escalation, because the losses that we are seeing now, how do you undo it? How do you mitigate it? It's unfathomable in a way. And then another one would be, look, right now, this is not just a war between Russia and Ukraine, right? This is a war between ideologies. This idea that all countries are equal. They all have a right to self-determination, regardless of how large an economic player they are, whether they are a superpower or not. This is the world order that so many generations have had the privilege to grow into, right? And that's the world order that is being defended at the moment in Ukraine. We don't have a perfect track record of propping up that world order, again, guaranteeing, right, creating systems that guarantee self-determination and sovereignty for all nations. So not just for the Philippines, but I think for the entire world, this is the time to revisit that concept, right? Remember how human rights are universal, how human dignity, respect for human dignity is universal. And again, respect for every country's sovereignty and right to self-determination is really important. These are no longer, I think at the moment, these are no longer sort of concepts we read about in books or theoretical things that we ponder. These issues are right in front of us at the moment. And I think our commitment to these principles is being tested. And again, of course, these have been tested in the past too, but they're being tested in even more on a larger scale. So a really, really, really important time to keep an eye on the global developments. But again, think about how we as individuals and how our nations think about the universal human rights and nations' rights for self-determination.
Thank you. And Dr. Davis, final word, please.
Yeah, look, I think that taking this from the perspective of strategic context, what are the implications of this looking in years into the future? If we have a prolonged period of tension in Europe, with the Putin regime in power in Moscow and maybe in control of half of Ukraine, we avoid the ugly scenario of direct intervention, but we can't avoid the bad scenario of a new Iron Curtain where the US and Russia, NATO and Russia, sorry, are arrayed against each other in Eastern Europe. Then the US is going to have its hands full in terms of meeting security and defense commitments in Europe, and also responding to the challenge from a rising China. So, from the Philippines' perspective, the concern should be that China, looking on to this crisis, will be thinking in terms of its moves against Taiwan, and then be thinking what it wants to achieve after that. And if China were successful in taking Taiwan, its geostrategic positioning in the region is enhanced considerably in terms of both isolating Japan in terms of economic supply lines, but also being able to project power south towards the Philippines and and greatly having an ability to coerce the Philippines directly. So I think the Philippines needs to think about that long-term strategic perspective in terms of its regional role and what are the possibilities of something happening in this decade in the region, and how they can better enhance their relationship with the United States, with Japan, with Australia, and also within ASEAN to try and strengthen ASEAN's stance on this, because the ASEAN way of consensus politics and neutrality are fine and good in peacetime, but we're not in peacetime anymore. So ASEAN as an organization, I think, needs to decide where it stands on this, and how can we counterbalance and deter China in a few years' time from doing something against Taiwan to match what Russia is doing against Ukraine now. And so I'd like to leave you with that thought that, you know, how do we prevent the next war by understanding the current war?
Thank you so much. And on behalf of the organizers and our partner institutions, I would like to thank our three speakers for this morning, Dr. Malcolm Davis, Ms. Maya Otarashvili, and Mr. Shinkichi Fujimori, for their invaluable insights about this issue. Just a reminder as well for the rest of the audience in this webinar, there is an evaluation form that you need to fill out to get your certificates. The links are now being posted in our chat box. Also, a reminder that there is another event that we scheduled for tomorrow, but we will be rescheduling that at a later date. So please wait for further announcements regarding the new schedule. So once again, thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you to the team at FNI, at Miriam College. Thank you to all our participants for such a lively discussion, separate as it may seem in our chat box. And once again, have a great day to everybody. I hope to see you again in our next event. Thank you.